study of Daniel is going to be kind of a lead in to several suggestions that we had. One was the intertestamental period, which Daniel has to do with. The last few chapters that deal with the prophetic part of Daniel. And then, of course, that will lead us into Revelation later on. So we have some wonderful studies coming to our attention. The first few chapters of Daniel are, we might call narratives. And like the first 6 chapters, the last few chapters are more prophetic, even though there is some prophecy in the first few chapters, like Daniel chapter 2. So we will see that, and hopefully you had a chance to read a lot of the introduction. Daniel, there's probably as much been written about the book of Daniel as about any other book in the Bible. So we will, I hope you had a chance to read all of that about times that it was written and all of that type of thing, and hopefully you had a chance to look at Daniel chapter 1 and read it, and hopefully get to some of the questions. Like I said, we learn a lot about Daniel from the very first verse, because it sets if you want to call it the background to the entire book. And would someone read Daniel 1:1 for us?
In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it.
Okay, well, there's the background to the book, and that's why so much of what happens in these next few chapters happens. That's why. Babylon, probably at that time, was possibly the greatest city in the world. Probably had a population close to 200,000. So, this was a big, big place. Held lots of people. And as we'll see, it was a massive place that you read about. And so we find out some people involved was Jehoiakim. He was the king of Judah. The 3rd year would have been, between 606, 605 BC. So that's when this starts to happen. A little over 600 years BC. And Jehoiakim, this was his vassal name. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar had given him this name. All right. So he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, which was a horrible idea on his part, but he did it anyway. But he became his, almost like a servant in a sense. So let's go to our questions in the book, and we will answer some of those today. So, first of all, question number 1 says, Daniel and his 3 friends are mentioned in the New Testament book of Hebrews, chapter 11. All right. So what particular references there are pertinent to their situation, and what events are alluded to? What does the writer of Hebrews mention about that at least would pertain to Daniel and his friends?
This one was hard, but was it because they stopped the mouths of lions and quenched the violence of fire?
Yeah. Of course, Daniel being in the lion's den, so stop the mouths of lions and quench the violence of fire would have to do with the 3 friends who were in the furnace of fire.
Oh, I get it now.
So that would be, an allusion. So the writer of Hebrews is alluding to something that, took place over, 600 years in the past. So that's the first thing we run across. Question number 2, what are a few of the cultural and religious challenges faced by the Jewish captives taken to Babylon as exiles and slaves?
Well, a lot of it had to do with their food.
Okay, a lot of it
came from either unclean animals, or they didn't do all that ritual about cleaning it before they prepared it.
Yep.
And some of it could have been from a sacrifice could have been used as a sacrifice.
Yeah, to God. So there's probably all kinds of things involved. You know, Babylon had all kinds of gods. That's what the name Babylon basically means, the gate of the gods. So this was all, you know, a very pagan, idol-filled place. And, you know, a lot of food was sacrificed to them. So, you know, we talked about that when we studied 1 Corinthians, about food sacrificed to idols. And so, you know, that was probably part of it. And so one of the things I want to point out is what verse 2 says about why all of this happened. Would someone read verse 2 of chapter 1 for us?
And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God.
Okay, so who was responsible for all of this happening? The Lord. The Lord was behind all of this. He's the one that brought it all to take pass. It was him that gave Jehoiakim, as he says, into his hand and the articles and so forth. So God was the one that did that. It was the Lord's doing.
Them all the warning in the world.
Oh, yeah. Oh, warning. Oh, my. Yeah. You might say pages of warnings. That's exactly right. And so the most promising, verse 3, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good looking, gifted in wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. So these were the choicest of the young men. And when he talks about young men here, he talks about some of the children of Israel. Word probably refers to teenagers. So we're talking about someone, 14 to 18, somewhere in that range. So, see, these people were young enough that they were teachable, even though some of the 14-year-olds I have, I'm not sure are teachable, but supposedly these are teachable people. They've not been so ingrained in the Jewish background that they can't be taught the Chaldean literature and the Chaldean ways, the Chaldean language and all of that. So culture. And so these were the most promising, and they were going to be put into what we would call government service. I mean, that's basically what this comes in to. And primarily for the most special, we'll see later, we probably won't get to it today, would be working directly for the king. So they were attractive. They had to be attractive. They had to be intelligent. They had to, have these abilities, to learn and to all of this. So the language and the literature of the Chaldeans, this was an Akkadian language, and it was probably a type at this time of cuneiform. And because they were like entering an academy, a 3-year-long training academy. Basically what it was, like a 3-year-long school. Almost kind of like a trade school, because they had to learn all these different things. And so the king wanted them to have the best food. So the choices, he talks about the king's delicacies and so forth. So those were the things that he wanted them to have. All right, so we go to question 3. What was the city of Babylon like in the days of Nebuchadnezzar II? What were some things that you found out about the city itself?
Kind of compare it to a city today. I mean, it was like the hub for commercial So,
kind of like the world center, wasn't it? It was like the center of everything. And it had massive fortifications. I mean, massive walls. Walls within walls and gates. And, you know, the famous gate of Ishtar was there in Babylon. And so, yeah, just massive place that went on for miles and miles and encompassed, you know, so many buildings and, you know, gardens. Talk about the hanging gardens of Babylon. So, yeah, it was an amazing place. And so that's where Daniel and his three friends are. They have been taken from Jerusalem, you know, from the area of Judea and what that land looked like, and taken to Babylon, which was a desert, flat desert. You know, I mean, they didn't have hills, they didn't have bumps in the road. That's how flat the Babylon was. It was just a flat desert. So they left their culture, their language, their relatives, family, and they were taken to this huge city. So question 4, who was King Jehoiakim and what were the circumstances of the defeat at the hands of the Babylonians? What had he done? He had, you know, Babylon had went into Egypt and had ended up basically defeating Egypt, but Jehoiakim thought that he could, well, you might say, hook up with Egypt, and so he stopped paying tribute to Babylon. Oh, that was a bad idea. Very bad idea. But he stopped paying tribute to Babylon, and so that's what got Nebuchadnezzar riled, was because he had stopped paying tribute to him. And how was God involved in the humbling of the nation? Well, it was the Lord who delivered Judah into the hands of the Babylonians. The Bible says it was God who had done that. God was behind all of this happening. All right, so question 5, in the training of new recruits for government service, a special diet was formulated and imposed upon all such young men during the period of their indoctrination. In what way did that pose a unique set of problems for observant Jews placed in such a circumstance? Well, Jeanette just mentioned that the food, some of it could have been offered to idols, which they weren't supposed to eat. Some of it was just from unclean foods, or it could have been prepared in a way that went against the law of Moses. So there was a lot of things that it was a real challenge.
I wonder if they Babylonian pork.
Oh, the one, I don't know. Yeah, that could have been one of the ones. Yeah, that could have been one of them. Yeah. So the next question, 6, why did the Babylonians give all new recruits to government service a new name? What was the purpose of giving someone a new name? You know, this happened a lot in the Old Testament with different countries. Why would you give someone a new name? That's right. Wanted them, that was one way to help get them away from thinking about their homeland, their home culture, their home family. Give them a Babylonian name. And in particular, these names had to do with what? Why were those names chosen? All right, like the Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, why were they given, like why was Daniel called Belteshazzar and Hananiah, Shadrach, and so forth? What was the significance of those names? What were they associated with? Okay.
I read it, but now I can't remember.
They were associated with
elements of their worship.
Yeah, they're pagan gods, right? Their worship of pagan gods. And so that was another way. Not only did they give them Babylonian names, but the names had to do with the Babylonian gods and worshiping them. So that was just another way to kind of indoctrinate them, like it says here. So how important is determination in the outcome of any enterprise? Of course, you read about it. Absolutely essential. Did Daniel and his three friends demonstrate this important quality? Well, of course they did. All right. In a very, big way. Nebuchadnezzar and then the government people there in Babylon wanted to get Daniel and his three friends to compromise. I mean, that's, they wanted them to be indoctrinated, to compromise, and that's what they were trying to get them to do, was to compromise. And so what Daniel and them did, question 8, how did God prove faithful to Daniel and his friends? What was the test? Well, at the very first test.
They said they would eat vegetables for 10 days.
Okay.
And they would compare them to the other ones that ate all those delicacies and see who came out fairer.
See who came out better, right? And so Daniel and his friends, they were eating basically a plant-based diet. Whereas the others, there were a whole lot of people in this academy, this training academy. The others ate all of these delicacies and fine food and wine and so forth. And so the test was, Daniel said, of course, there was steps he went through to get this, talking to different, government people, but, just give us a test. 10 days, that's all we want, 10 days. You wouldn't think there would be difference in 10 days, but again, God was behind this, all right?
Begs the question what they were required to eat.
Yeah. So we have... here God was showing, and then through these four people, that this diet that was according to the law of Moses. All right, and that's what was so important. Maybe not the diet itself, but showing that this was what God wanted them to do. And so they, of course, ended up better. They looked better. They could, they were fatter in the flesh. All right. So they did not give in to the temptation. All the other people, these were the only four that had this special diet. All the other ones in this academy training place was eating the king's food. Just these four. But they didn't give in to that temptation to eat, unclean food, unclean delicacies. So, and it talks about in our work, what verse was it? Oh, it was talked about in verse 2 about how these things were carried into the land of Shinar. Well, Shinar, that area was infamous for wickedness. So this was a very wicked place. And so that's what happened. God was behind all of this. And we saw that in 2 or 3, 4 places in this first chapter where God was behind it. Well, then at the end of the 3 years, they'd gone through this academy, and so it was time for their final exam, basically, and so they all had to appear before King Nebuchadnezzar. And toward the end, verse 19, and the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. So not only did they come through the academy with flying colors, but they were immeasurably better than anybody else in the entire kingdom concerning these matters of, as he called them, wisdom and understanding. And of course, this would come into play in the very next chapter when Daniel interprets King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So this was just a prelude, all right? And then he ends up by saying in the last verse, thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. And of course, we're talking about, so Daniel doesn't say about his 3 friends here in this verse, but Daniel lived that entire 70 years of captivity in Babylon. The whole time. Never went home. So he came as a teenager and stayed until he was almost 90. So that was quite a statement about Daniel and what people can do even in cultures that are very ungodly, anti-God, whatever you want to call them. So there was quite a statement. It's a very tiny verse, but it means a tremendous amount. So we will look, Daniel chapter 2 is very, very important chapter. I'm sure we cannot get it done in one Sunday, so please look at Daniel chapter 2, go over the read it in the Bible, read the material in the chapter, and we'll start looking at it, Lord willing, next Sunday morning.